What you are about to hear is a work of fiction. The people, places, and events depicted in this story are products of the author's imagination or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual individuals, living or deceased, or to real situations is purely coincidental. These stories may explore themes of crime, injustice, and human suffering. While fictional, they reflect real emotions and difficult truths that some may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
Eddie, you have two choices. You can confess to the authorities, or we press charges for everything. Clara's voice was steady as steel, but her heart was breaking as she stared across the table at her brother. Please, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know just how far our stories reach. But let me start from the beginning, when Clara Thompson still believed that blood was thicker than the ink on a balance sheet. Clara was 48 years old, a woman who had built her life like a carefully curated bookshelf, each chapter neat, each volume in its place. She owned a small bookstore in the heart of Elmwood, a quaint town nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York. The shop, named Pages of Yesterday, was her sanctuary, filled with the musty scent of old paper and the soft rustle of turning pages that seemed to whisper secrets from another time. The morning light filtered through the large front windows, casting golden rectangles across the hardwood floors as Clara arranged a display of autumn-themed novels. Her auburn hair, now streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in a practical bun that had become her signature look. She wore flowing skirts and soft cardigans that seemed to embrace customers like a warm hug, exuding the kind of warmth that drew people in and made them want to linger among the stacks. Clara had inherited the bookstore from her late mother 15 years ago, right after her divorce from a man who preferred his freedom to their marriage vows. Since then, she had poured her soul into transforming the shop into a community hub where locals gathered for book clubs, poetry readings, and quiet afternoons lost in stories that took them far from their everyday troubles. Life had etched fine lines around Clara's eyes from years of squinting at ledgers and smiling at customers, but beneath that gentle exterior was a steel core, forged from raising 2 children alone and navigating the treacherous waters of small business ownership. Her daughter Jessica was now 25 and living in California, while her son Michael had just started college. Both children adored the bookstore and their mother's fierce independence, but they worried about her being alone. Clara wasn't truly alone, though. She had her brother Edward. Edward Thompson was 5 years younger than Clara, a charismatic accountant who worked at a prestigious firm in Albany. Where Clara was thoughtful and cautious, Edward was bold and charming, with a smile that could convince anyone of anything. He lived an hour's drive away with his wife Patricia and their lifestyle that seemed to stretch just beyond the limits of what his position at the accounting firm should reasonably afford. Edward often mentioned big opportunities and surefire investments, and Clara had noticed he'd been buying expensive things lately: a new BMW, designer watches, weekend trips to Atlantic City that he laughingly called business conferences. After their parents passed away 5 years ago, Edward had stepped up to help Clara with the complex world of business finances. He'd been her rock during the divorce, helping with the children when she was overwhelmed, giving her a loan to keep the store afloat when her ex-husband stopped paying child support, even helping her navigate the legal paperwork when she inherited the bookstore from their mother. "You're the creative one, sis," he'd say with that winning smile and a playful wink. "Let me handle the numbers. It's what I do best." And Clara had been genuinely grateful. Edward had proven his loyalty and love through actions, not just words. Clara trusted him implicitly. After all, Edward had been there during her darkest hours. When her marriage fell apart, he'd helped with the children. When money was tight during the divorce, he'd even given her a loan to keep the store afloat. Blood was thicker than water, and certainly thicker than ink on a balance sheet. That crisp autumn morning, as the leaves outside turned shades of gold and crimson, Clara sat at her desk in the cramped back room of the bookstore. The space was cluttered with boxes of new arrivals, stacks of invoices, and a computer that had seen better days. The bell above the front door jingled softly as a customer entered, but Clara barely noticed. She was absorbed in reviewing the quarterly statements Edward had emailed her the night before. Something was wrong. The numbers didn't add up. Sales had been steady, actually better than steady, with a real surge from the summer reading program she'd organized for local kids. The community had embraced it enthusiastically, and parents had bought armloads of books. Yet somehow, the bank balance was lower than expected, several $1,000s short, in fact. Clara frowned, adjusting her reading glasses and leaning closer to the screen. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting shadows that danced across the spreadsheet. Perhaps it was a simple error, a transposed digit, or a delayed transaction. These things happened, especially with all the automated systems banks use these days. She picked up her phone and dialed Edward's number, listening to it ring while she stared at the confusing numbers on her screen. "Clara! Good morning, sunshine!" Edward's voice boomed through the phone with that familiar false cheer that had once comforted her, but now seemed somehow hollow, like an echo in an empty room. "Hey, Eddie," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "Just going over the books you sent. There's a discrepancy here. The summer sales were great, but the bank balance doesn't reflect it. Can you take a look?" There was a pause, just a heartbeat too long before Edward responded. "Of course, Clara. You know how these bank systems can be. Probably just a delayed transfer or maybe some automated fees I forgot to mention. Don't worry your pretty head about it. I'll sort it out and get back to you today." His laugh was light and dismissive, but Clara caught something in his voice, a slight strain, like someone trying too hard to sound casual. "Are you sure? Because it's not a small amount, Eddie. We're talking about several $1,000s. Trust me, sis, I've been doing this for 20 years. You know I've always taken care of you, right? I'll have this figured out by tomorrow. Maybe we can even find a way to make your money work harder for you. I've been looking at some investments that could really pay off big." Clara hung up, but the uneasy feeling lingered like smoke in the air. She tried to shake it off, turning her attention to a customer who needed help finding a birthday gift for her grandson. But throughout the day, as she recommended books and rang up sales, her mind kept returning to those missing numbers. Edward had always been there for her. He'd helped with the kids when they were young, been her financial advisor, even loaned her money during the divorce. It had to be nothing more than a simple mistake. But when Edward called back that evening, his explanations only made things worse. "Clara, I found the issue," he said, his voice carrying that practiced confidence she'd once found so reassuring. "The bank processed some of your quarterly tax payments early. That's where the discrepancy came from. Everything's actually in better shape than we thought." "Tax payments? But we just paid those last month." "Business taxes are quarterly, remember? Don't worry about it. I've got everything under control. The money's all accounted for." Clara wanted to believe him, but something felt off about his explanation. She'd been running the bookstore for 15 years. She knew when her tax payments were due. 2 days later, when she called to follow up, Edward had another excuse ready. "Actually, sis, I found another issue. There was a clerical error at my firm's office. Someone input the wrong account number for one of your transfers. We're sorting it out with the bank now. These things take time, but everything will be back to normal by next week." A week after that, it was a computer glitch that had temporarily moved funds to the wrong portfolio. Then it was an investment rebalancing that would show up on next month's statement. Each explanation sounded plausible on its own, but together they formed a pattern that made Clara's stomach churn with anxiety. Edward always had an answer, always had a reason, but the numbers never seemed to add up the way they should. As the days passed, Clara's world began to crumble one bounced check at a time. The first major crisis hit when her check to the electric company bounced. Clara stared at the notice in disbelief, her hands trembling slightly as she held the pink slip. She'd never had a check bounce in her entire life. She was meticulous about her finances, checking her balance regularly and keeping careful records. She called the bank immediately, speaking to a customer service representative who sounded bored and slightly irritated. "Mrs. Thompson, your account shows insufficient funds. The check was for $437, but your balance was only $212. "That's impossible," Clara said, her voice rising with panic. "I had over $3,000 in that account last week. I'm showing several large withdrawals, ma'am. Would you like me to read them to you?" Clara's heart pounded as the representative rattled off a list of transactions she didn't recognize. Transfers to something called EJT Consulting for financial services, withdrawals labeled as investment management fees, each one authorized with her signature or what appeared to be her signature. "I didn't authorize any of these," Clara whispered, sinking into her desk chair. The bookstore suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in around her. "Ma'am, these all show proper authorization. If you believe there's been fraud, you'll need to file a report and—" Clara hung up, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. This couldn't be happening. There had to be an explanation. She called Edward again, but it went straight to voicemail. His cheerful recorded voice seemed to mock her. "You've reached Edward Thompson. I'm probably helping a client secure their financial future, so leave a message and I'll get back to you." More disasters followed in quick succession. Suppliers called about unpaid invoices for books she'd already received and sold. Her business credit card was declined when she tried to pay for the monthly book distributor order. The landlord left a terse message about late rent. Clara's stomach knotted with worry and shame. She found herself jumping every time the phone rang, afraid of another creditor demanding payment she couldn't make. Sleep became elusive, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. She could lose the store. She could lose everything she'd built since the divorce. But she confided in no one at first, too ashamed to admit that her carefully ordered world might be falling apart. How could she explain that she'd been so naive as to give someone else, even her brother, complete control over her finances? The autumn days grew shorter and colder, mirroring Clara's darkening mood. She watched the leaves fall from the oak tree outside her store window, each one a reminder that winter was coming and she still didn't understand what was happening to her money. Then came the call that changed everything. Clara was helping a customer find a cookbook when her cell phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it. She'd been getting too many calls from bill collectors lately, but something made her answer. "Is this Clara Thompson of Pages of Yesterday Bookstore?" The voice was professional, clipped. "Yes, this is Clara. This is Janet Morrison from Riverside Publishing. We've been trying to reach you about your overdue account. You owe us $12,000 for the September shipment, and the payment is now 60 days past due." Clara's knees went weak. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. My brother handles all the payments. Edward Thompson from Hartwell and Associates. He should have—" "Ma'am, we've never heard of anyone by that name handling your account. Our records show that you personally guaranteed payment for these orders. If we don't receive payment within 10 days, we'll have to turn this over to collections." After the woman hung up, Clara stood frozen in the middle of her bookstore, surrounded by the very books she apparently owed $12,000 for. The customer she'd been helping cleared her throat awkwardly and mumbled something about coming back later. Clara's mind reeled. Edward was stealing from her. Her own brother, the man she'd trusted with everything, was systematically destroying her life. But she needed help to prove it, and she knew exactly who to call. Lydia Brennan had been Clara's best friend since childhood. They'd grown up 3 houses apart, sharing secrets under the old oak tree in Clara's backyard, dreaming about their futures over countless sleepovers. Now 50 years old, Lydia was a semi-retired accountant with steel gray hair cut in a sharp bob and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from 30 years of auditing major corporations. Clara called her that evening, her voice breaking as she tried to explain what was happening. "Lyd, I need your eyes on something. It's personal, and I think I'm in real trouble." Lydia arrived at the bookstore the next morning before Clara had even finished making coffee, her arms full of folders and her laptop bag slung over her shoulder. She wore a crisp navy suit despite being semi-retired, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing as they surveyed Clara's tear-stained face. "Show me everything," she said simply, setting her things down on the desk in the back room. For the next 2 hours, they huddled over Clara's financial documents like detectives examining evidence at a crime scene. Lydia's expression grew darker with each page, her lips pressed into a thin line as she traced transactions with her finger. "Clara, these transfers aren't random," Lydia said finally, her voice grim. "Someone's been siphoning funds systematically. Look at this small amounts at first, then escalating over the past 6 months. And these signatures on the authorization forms." She held up a sheet to the light. "They look forged." Clara's hands trembled as she stared at what appeared to be her own signature on documents she'd never seen before. "Edward handles all this. He manages my business finances because I trust him with everything. He said it was easier for him to handle all the transactions through his system at the firm." "That's your first mistake," Lydia interrupted gently. "Trust is good, but verification is better. Do you have access to any of his records, passwords, account numbers?" Clara shook her head miserably. "He manages everything. All the passwords, all the accounts he said it was, for security and efficiency." Lydia sighed deeply, then squeezed Clara's shoulder. "We're going to figure this out, but we need help. Someone who can dig into the digital trail." That's when Ryan Mitchell knocked on the back door, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop next door. At 32, Ryan was Clara's most trusted employee, a former literature major who'd worked at the bookstore for 5 years after his own dreams of being a novelist had faded into the reality of needing steady income. He was tall and lanky, with prematurely gray hair and kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Clara had come to think of him almost like a son, and his loyalty to her and the store was absolute. "Boss, you look terrible," he said with characteristic bluntness, setting down the coffee. "What's wrong?" Clara hesitated, then found herself spilling the entire story. Ryan listened in silence, his young face hardening with each revelation. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air, but none of them touched their cups. "That's completely messed up," Ryan said when she finished. "Your own brother? Let me help. I'm good with computers. Maybe I can trace those transfers online, find out where the money went." With Lydia's financial expertise and Ryan's digital skills, Clara suddenly had allies in her fight against Edward's betrayal. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope amid the devastation. But she had no idea how deep Edward's deception ran, or what they would uncover when they started digging into his web of lies. The investigation began in earnest that afternoon. Lydia suggested they meet at her home office to avoid any possibility of Edward showing up unexpectedly at the bookstore. Her house was a cozy Victorian on the outskirts of town, and her office was a converted sunroom filled with filing cabinets, a large oak desk, and plants that thrived in the afternoon light. The sound of rain pattering against the windows provided a somber backdrop as the 3 of them gathered around Lydia's desk, documents spread out like pieces of a puzzle they were desperate to solve. Ryan had brought his laptop, and his fingers flew over the keys as he traced the digital breadcrumbs Edward had left behind. "Okay, these transfers go to a shell company, EJT Consulting." "Wait, EJT." He looked up at Clara with dawning realization. "Those are his initials, aren't they? Edward James Thompson?" Clara felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. "Yes. Oh God, yes they are." Lydia nodded grimly. Classic embezzlement tactic. Set up a fake entity, invoice the victim for services never rendered, then pocket the money. "But we need more than circumstantial evidence if we're going to stop him." Ryan's investigation revealed a trail of financial destruction that took Clara's breath away. EJT Consulting had been receiving regular payments from Clara's accounts for 8 months, totaling nearly $50,000. But that wasn't all. Edward had also taken out loans using the bookstore as collateral, forged Clara's signature on investment documents, and even opened credit cards in her name. "Look at this," Ryan said, showing them bank records from the EJT account. "He's been withdrawing large amounts of cash from the EJT account regularly." Then, Ryan pulled up another screen. "I managed to trace some of his personal financial activity. These cash deposits to his personal account followed immediately by transfers to online gambling sites, casinos, sports betting platforms." Clara stared at the evidence in horror. "He's got a gambling problem." "A serious one," Lydia confirmed, examining the patterns. "He's been using your money to feed his addiction, but he's kept the business theft separate from the gambling." "Smart. Actually, it makes it harder to trace." Clara stared at the evidence in horror. The Edward she knew was a risk-taker, someone who lived life boldly. But this level of betrayal was beyond anything she could have imagined. Her brother, the man who'd walked her down the aisle at her wedding, who'd held her children when they were babies, had been systematically destroying her life to pay for his gambling debts. "There's more," Lydia said quietly, examining a bank statement. "He's been manipulating your investment portfolio too. Remember those safe stocks he said he was buying? They don't exist. He's been creating fake investment reports to hide the fact that he's stolen that money too." The scope of the theft was staggering. Clara's retirement savings, the store's emergency fund, even a college fund she'd been building for her future grandchildren, all of it gone, fed into Edward's insatiable gambling addiction. But Ryan had found something else, something that made Clara's blood run cold. "Clara, you need to see this," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Edward didn't just steal from you. He's been setting you up to take the fall. Look at these loan documents. He forged your signature as a guarantor. If these debts aren't paid, you could lose the bookstore, your house, everything." The room spun around Clara as the full weight of Edward's betrayal crashed over her. This wasn't just theft, it was a calculated attempt to destroy her entire life. How long had he been planning this? How long had he been looking at her with love in his eyes while plotting her financial ruin? "I can't believe this is happening," Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He's my brother. I trusted him with everything." Lydia moved to embrace her, and Clara found herself sobbing in her friend's arms like a child. The pain of betrayal was almost physical, a crushing weight in her chest that made it hard to breathe. But Ryan was still working, his jaw set with determination. "We're not going to let him get away with this. Look, I found contact information for someone at his firm. A colleague named Rebecca who handles audits. Maybe she knows something." Clara wiped her eyes, trying to pull herself together. "What would I say? I can't just accuse him outright." "You don't have to," Lydia said. "Let me handle this. I speak accountant." The call to Rebecca yielded more disturbing information. Edward's firm was struggling, teetering on the edge of financial trouble. He'd been under tremendous pressure lately, working longer hours, seeming more stressed during their phone calls. The partners have been asking a lot of questions about client accounts. Rebecca had mentioned during their conversation, Edward's been defensive about his portfolio management. "Between you and me, I think he might be in over his head with some high-risk investments." The partners are starting to ask questions. Rebecca had confided during the carefully orchestrated phone call. "Edward's been acting strange lately, paranoid, defensive. Some clients have complained about irregularities in their accounts." Clara felt sick. How many other people had Edward deceived? How many other families had he put at risk to feed his desperate need for quick money to solve his mounting problems? But Lydia was already thinking ahead, her analytical mind working through their options. "We can't just confront him directly. He'll deny everything, destroy evidence, maybe even disappear. We need to catch him in the act." "How?" Clara asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Setting a trap for her own brother felt like the ultimate betrayal, even after everything he'd done to her. "We set up a situation he can't resist." The plan Lydia devised was elegant in its simplicity. They would create a fictional opportunity, a large sum of money that Clara supposedly needed to invest quickly. Edward's gambling addiction and desperation would make the bait irresistible, and they'd have him on record attempting to steal from her again. "I'll tell him I received a grant for store expansion," Clara said, warming to the idea. "Something requiring immediate investment. He won't be able to resist." Ryan's role was crucial. He would set up recording equipment and create fake account trails that would document Edward's theft attempts in real time. "I'll make sure we get everything. Audio, video, digital records. By the time we're done, we'll have enough evidence to put him away." The next few days were agonizing as they prepared their trap. Clara had to continue pretending everything was normal, even as her world crumbled around her. She smiled at customers, recommended books, hosted her weekly book club meeting, all while knowing that her brother was actively working to destroy her life. The hardest part was the waiting, and the constant fear that Edward might somehow discover what they were planning. When he called to check on her, as he did every few days, Clara had to force cheerfulness into her voice while her heart pounded with anxiety. "How are you doing, sis? Any more of those bank hiccups?" he'd ask during one call, and Clara had to grip the phone tightly to keep her hands from shaking. "All cleared up," she'd lied smoothly. "You were right, just system glitches." But inside, she was torn apart by what she was about to do. This was her brother, the man who'd taught her to ride a bike, who'd scared away bullies when they were children. Was she really about to destroy him? Finally, everything was ready. Clara made the call that would either save her or destroy what remained of her family forever. "Eddie, I have incredible news. I got a grant for expansion $50,000. I need your help investing it right away." Edward's response was immediate and eager. "Clara, that's fantastic. Of course I'll help. This is exactly the kind of opportunity we've been waiting for. I'll drive up tomorrow and we'll get everything set up." As Clara hung up the phone, she felt a mix of anticipation and dread. Tomorrow, she would find out once and for all if her brother was the man she'd always believed him to be, or if he was the thief who'd been slowly destroying her life. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen. Clara arrived at the bookstore early, her stomach churning with nervous energy. Ryan was already there, making final adjustments to the hidden camera system he'd installed in the back office. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, studying Clara's pale face with concern. "We could still go to the police with what we have." "No," Clara said firmly. "I need to see it for myself. I need to know if my brother really is capable of looking me in the eye while he steals from me." Lydia arrived an hour later, carrying a briefcase full of meticulously prepared fake documents. She'd spent the previous evening creating a convincing paper trail for the fictional grant, complete with official-looking letterhead and authorization forms. "Remember," Lydia said, "let him lead the conversation. Don't push too hard or he might get suspicious. We just need him to attempt the transfer once he does that. We've got him." At exactly 2 o'clock, Edward's gleaming black SUV pulled into the bookstore's small parking lot. Clara watched through the window as her brother stepped out, adjusting his expensive suit jacket and checking his reflection in the car window. He looked prosperous, confident, nothing like a man drowning in gambling debts and criminal activity. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully as Edward entered, his arms spread wide for a hug. "There's my successful sister," he boomed, embracing Clara with what seemed like genuine warmth. "I'm so proud of you, Clara. This grant is going to change everything." Clara forced herself to return the hug, fighting down the urge to pull away from his touch. How could he seem so normal, so loving, while planning to rob her blind? "Thanks for coming so quickly, Eddie. I'm excited but also nervous. It's a lot of money to manage." "That's what big brothers are for," Edward said with his trademark grin. "Don't worry about a thing. I'll take care of everything." They moved to the back office, where Ryan discreetly retreated to give them privacy while remaining within range of the recording equipment. Lydia was hidden in the storage room next door, listening through a crack in the door. Clara showed Edward the fake grant documents, watching his eyes light up as he scanned the dollar amounts and terms. "This is incredible, Clara. 50,000 with minimal restrictions. We can really make this work for you." "I trust your judgment completely," Clara said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "What do you think we should do?" Edward pulled out his laptop with practiced efficiency. "First, we'll move it into a secure investment account I've set up. Then we can diversify some safe bonds, maybe some growth stocks. The key is getting it into the system quickly to maximize returns." As Clara watched, Edward logged into his banking system and began setting up a transfer from the fictional grant account to EJT Consulting. His fingers moved confidently across the keyboard, completely focused on the theft he was committing. "You're moving it to EJT Consulting?" Clara asked, her voice carefully neutral. "That's my investment management company," Edward said without missing a beat. "It's how I handle all the high-level transactions for my clients. Much more secure than regular banking channels." The lies came so easily to him, so smoothly, that Clara realized this wasn't the first time he'd used this story. How many other victims had he told the exact same thing? Within minutes, Edward had completed the fake transfer, showing Clara a confirmation screen that indicated $30,000 was being moved to his personal control. He leaned back in his chair with satisfaction, completely unaware that every keystroke had been recorded. "There we go," he said, his voice full of false warmth. "By tomorrow, this money will be working hard for your future, Clara. You made the right choice trusting me with this." Clara watched her brother's face as he lied to her with such practiced ease, and something inside her broke. This wasn't a moment of weakness or desperation. This was who Edward really was. A man who could look his sister in the eye while stealing her dreams. But she forced herself to nod and smile. "Thank you, Eddie. I don't know what I'd do without you." The words tasted like poison in her mouth. But the hardest part was still to come. "Eddie," Clara said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." Something in her tone must have warned him, because Edward's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "Of course, sis. What is it? Have you been having financial problems lately? Because if you need help, you know you can come to me." Edward's laugh was just a little too loud, a little too forced. "Financial problems? Clara, I'm doing great. Better than ever, actually. Why would you ask that?" "Because money has been disappearing from my accounts, Eddie. Thousands of dollars. And the transactions all point to EJT Consulting." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, indignation before settling on what Clara recognized as his poker face. "That's impossible," he said finally. "There must be some kind of mistake. Maybe identity theft or—" "Stop." Clara's voice was quiet but firm. "Just stop lying to me." She opened the folder Lydia had prepared and slid it across the desk. Edward's face went white as he saw the bank records, the forged signatures, the evidence of his systematic theft. "We know everything, Eddie. The gambling, the loans, the fake investment reports, all of it." For a moment, Edward looked like he might try to continue denying it. Then his shoulders sagged and the mask finally slipped, revealing the desperate, broken man underneath. "Clara, I can explain." "Explain how you stole from me? Explain how you forged my signature? Explain how you were willing to let me lose everything to pay for your gambling debts?" Tears were streaming down Edward's face now, but Clara felt no sympathy. She'd cried too many tears of her own over the past months. "I never meant for it to go this far," Edward whispered, his voice cracking. "It started small, just borrowing a few hundred here and there. I was going to pay it back as soon as I hit a big win. But the debts kept growing, and there were people threatening Patricia and the kids, and I didn't know what else to do. I was desperate, Clara. I'm in debt to some very dangerous people." "You could have asked for help," Clara said. "You could have told me the truth. And admit that the Golden Boy was a failure? That I'd gambled away everything we'd built? I couldn't face that shame, Clara. I thought I could fix it without anyone getting hurt." "Without anyone getting hurt?" Clara's voice rose with anger. "You nearly destroyed my life. I could have lost the store, my house, everything I've worked for. How is that not getting hurt?" At that moment, Lydia emerged from the storage room, her face grave. "Edward, you need to understand the full scope of what you've done. Clara isn't your only victim, is she? How many other clients have you stolen from?" Edward's silence was answer enough. Ryan appeared in the doorway, his laptop in hand. "I've got everything recorded, all the transfers, the confession, everything we need." Clara stood up slowly, feeling older than her 48 years. "Eddie, you have two choices. You can confess to the authorities and sign over all the EJT assets to make restitution and get help for your gambling addiction. Or we press charges for embezzlement, fraud, and forgery, and you go to prison." Edward looked up at his sister with eyes full of pain and regret. "Clara, please, I'm your brother, we're family." "Family doesn't steal from family," Clara said firmly. "Family doesn't destroy the people they're supposed to protect. You made your choice, Eddie. Now I'm making mine." Over the following weeks, Clara sat through multiple meetings with Detective Morrison at the Elmwood Police Department, watching as Edward signed confession after confession. He'd chosen cooperation over prosecution, agreeing to make full restitution and enter a comprehensive treatment program for gambling addiction. The legal process was complex and emotionally draining, but Clara had already recovered most of her stolen money through the seizure of Edward's assets. The boat he'd bought with her retirement fund, the expensive jewelry he'd purchased for Patricia with money meant for Clara's emergency fund, all of it was being liquidated to pay back his victims. Patricia had filed for divorce within 2 weeks, taking their children and moving back to her mother's house 3 states away. Edward was alone now, facing the consequences of his choices without the family he'd sacrificed everything to impress with his fake success. Clara should have felt vindicated, but mostly she just felt sad. She'd lost a brother not to death, but to something almost worse. The Edward she'd loved and trusted had never really existed. He'd been a mask worn by a desperate addict who saw her as nothing more than an easy mark. But she hadn't lost everything. Ryan had proven himself to be more than just an employee. He was family of choice, someone who'd stood by her when her blood family had betrayed her. Lydia had shown her the meaning of true friendship, dropping everything to help Clara fight for her life and livelihood. And the community had rallied around her in ways that took her breath away. Word of Edward's theft had spread through Elmwood, but instead of judgment, Clara found support. Customers came not just to buy books, but to share their own stories of betrayal and recovery. The bookstore became a place of healing, not just for Clara, but for others who'd been wounded by the people they'd trusted most. 8 months later, Clara stood in the expanded section of Pages of Yesterday, watching Ryan help a customer find the perfect novel for her book club. The grant money, the real grant money she'd applied for and received after Edward's arrest, had allowed her to add a coffee shop and reading nook that had become the heart of the store. Lydia stopped by every Tuesday for their weekly coffee date, bringing financial reports and friendship in equal measure. Clara had learned to read every line of those reports herself, never again willing to trust her financial future to someone else entirely. The bookstore was thriving in ways Clara had never imagined. The story of her betrayal and recovery had attracted customers from neighboring towns, drawn by her resilience and the authentic community she'd built. Sales were up 40% from the previous year, and Clara had even hired 2 part-time employees to help manage the increased business. Edward sent letters occasionally from the rehabilitation facility where he was serving his sentence. They were full of apologies and promises to make amends, but Clara hadn't responded to any of them yet. Forgiveness would come in time, perhaps, but trust was something that could never be rebuilt. Some bridges, once burned, left only ashes behind. As the sun set through the bookstore windows, painting the walls golden with the last light of day, Clara reflected on the lessons she'd learned. She'd discovered that family wasn't just about blood, it was about the people who showed up when your world was falling apart. She'd learned that trust was a precious gift that should be given carefully and verified always. Most importantly, she'd learned that betrayal, while devastating, didn't have to define her story. The evening air was crisp as Clara locked up the store, the familiar ritual bringing her peace. Ryan had left an hour earlier, but not before reminding her about the author reading they were hosting the following week. The local paper had written a feature story about Clara's recovery and the bookstore's renaissance, and bookstores from 3 neighboring towns had called asking for advice on community building. Clara smiled as she walked to her car, keys jingling softly in the quiet evening air. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new customers, new stories to discover and share. But tonight, she was content in the knowledge that she had built something real and lasting, not just a business, but a community, a sanctuary, a second chance. As she drove home through the familiar streets of Elmwood, Clara caught sight of her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at her was stronger than the one who had discovered those first discrepancies in her accounts nearly a year ago. Her eyes held wisdom earned through pain, and her smile was genuine in a way it hadn't been for years. The house was quiet when she arrived, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. Clara made herself a cup of tea and settled into her favorite reading chair with a novel she'd been saving for a quiet evening. Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. The book remained unopened in her lap as Clara watched the snow through her window. She thought about Edward, probably sitting in a similar chair in his halfway house, wrestling with his own demons and the wreckage of the life he'd built on lies. She felt a twinge of sadness for him, not for what he'd done to her, but for what he'd done to himself. Addiction was a prison of its own making, and Edward would spend years fighting to free himself from its grip. But Clara's story had taken a different turn. She'd chosen healing over hatred, community over isolation, truth over comfortable lies. The betrayal had nearly destroyed her. But in the end, it had shown her who she really was and what she was truly capable of. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica, her daughter in California. "Mom, I'm so proud of you. Can't wait to see the new expansion when I visit next month. Love you." Clara smiled, typing back, "Love you too, sweetheart. Can't wait to show you everything we've built." And it was true. What Clara had built in the aftermath of Edward's betrayal was more than just a successful bookstore. It was a testament to the power of resilience, the strength found in chosen family, and the healing that comes from refusing to let someone else's darkness eclipse your own light. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the scars of autumn and promising the renewal of spring. Clara opened her book and began to read, surrounded by the peace she had fought so hard to reclaim. In the distance, she could hear the church bells chiming the hour, their sound carrying across the quiet town like a blessing. Tomorrow would bring new stories, new customers, new possibilities. But tonight, Clara Thompson sat in her own story, one of betrayal transformed into triumph, of trust rebuilt on a foundation of wisdom, and of a woman who had refused to let anyone else write her ending. The pages of her life were still being written, and for the first time in years, Clara was the one holding the pen. Outside, the snow fell softly on Elmwood, covering the world in forgiveness and the promise of new beginnings. And in a small house on Maple Street, a woman who had survived the ultimate betrayal settled in to read about other people's adventures, content in the knowledge that her own greatest adventure, the journey back to herself, was just beginning. The last thing Clara saw before sleep claimed her was the book still open in her lap, its pages filled with stories of hope and redemption. Stories not so different from her own. In the morning, she would wake to a world transformed by snow, return to a bookstore filled with possibility, and continue building the life she'd almost lost. But tonight, surrounded by the peace she'd fought to reclaim, Clara Thompson was exactly where she belonged. The story of pages of yesterday was really just beginning, and Clara couldn't wait to see what the next chapter would bring. Thank you for listening until the end. If you enjoyed the story, please consider leaving us a like. This helps us reach more people.